under the video, the tafsir itself makes this claim that this is what the Christians were saying, that this is something that the ignorant sects among the Christians themselves were claiming. And so based on these sayings of, or beliefs of the Christians, obviously of their time period, this is how these Muslims interpret it that way. Although again, they do not say that that the Prophet explained that, or that Allah himself said that that's what it means.
They are telling you what Allah is saying here. That's what a tafsir is. The tafsir is trying to communicate to the reader what the Quran says. There were no Christians that included Mary in the Trinity, because if they would have to add Mary at the expense of either the Father, the Son, or the Spirit, taking one of them out and replace them with Mary. Just adding Mary would make the Trinity to a quadrinity, since you would not have just 3 persons in the Godhead, but 4. And therefore the Quran would still be wrong.
They base their understanding on that because they say the sects among the Christians were making such claims, and that's why they came to that interpretation. But again, that doesn't mean that that's what the Quran says. And in fact, as I said again, the text itself does not say that.
Okay, then what is the Quran saying? Remember, no explanation from your God, none from your Prophet. So do tell us, Imam Lewis, what does the text say? It is of no use to appeal to your previous reading, because in my video I have flattened your explanation and shown that it is impossible to read it that way. Then what is the Quran saying?
Now usually when we bring this up, their response is that, well, hey, we don't believe that, my sect doesn't believe that. And see, him not being, I've heard him before attack the Catholics, is that the problem here is that these Protestants, or whatever sect he is, they think that their belief is the original belief of Christianity. They fail to realize that their belief did not come into existence until the 1500s. That's what they fail to realize. When they hear these things, they say, oh, well, hey, we don't believe that, we never believed that. You don't know what the early Christians believed. Let's take a look and see what Bart Ehrman tells us about this. In Bart Ehrman's book, Misquoting Jesus, on page 152, we read as follows. He says, we know a good deal about Christianity during the 2nd and 3rd centuries, the time, say, between the completion of the writing of the New Testament books and the conversion of the Roman Emperor Constantine to the religion, which, as we have seen, changed everything. These 2 centuries were particularly rich in theological diversity among the early Christians. In fact, the theological diversity was so extensive that groups calling themselves Christians adhered to beliefs and practices that most Christians today would insist were not Christian at all. In the 2nd and 3rd centuries, there were, of course, Christians who believed that there was only one God, the creator of all there is. Other people who called themselves Christians, however, insisted that there were 2 different gods, one of the Old Testament, a God of wrath, and one of the New Testament, a God of love and mercy. These were not simply 2 different facets of the same God, they were actually 2 different gods. Strikingly, the groups that made these claims, including the followers of Marcion, whom we have already met, insisted that their views were the true teachings of Jesus and his apostles. Other groups, for example, the Gnostic Christians, insisted that there were not just 2 gods, but 12. Others said 30. Others still said 365. All these groups claimed to be Christians, insisting that their views were true and had been taught by Jesus and his followers. Why didn't these other groups simply read their New Testaments to see their views were wrong? It is because there was no New Testament. So how does Nagdeeman sit here and attempt to make this claim about, the Quran being wrong? Again, it doesn't say Mary's part of the Trinity, but in either case, trying to make a claim when, as we see, there was no set belief amongst the early Christians. They had all types of beliefs, believing in 12 gods, 365 gods, a different God from Old and New Testament. So how does he sit here and try to attempt to make it appear as if his belief is the original and the right belief, when in fact we see there was no correct and defined belief amongst the early Christians?
Now Shadid tries to run to Bart Ehrman to try to salvage Allah from this mistake that he makes in the Quran. He reads from Bart Ehrman to try to show that there was a diversity of beliefs among sects, which according to Shadid shows that the Quran might be right after all. Let's deal with the red herrings and straw man that Shadid erects and then attacks as if he makes valid claims. First, I have defended Catholics in your room because you misrepresent them constantly to try to make Islam look good. Second, Shadid claimed that I act as if my sect didn't exist until the 1500s, which is false. My sect goes back to the apostles, who were people of sola scriptura and tota scriptura. Just because the partial restoration of the movement of the apostles occurred in the 1500s doesn't mean that it didn't exist before that. That's why it's called restoration. Remember, the apostles were Messianic Jews. They weren't Catholics or Protestants. They were Jews who believed in Yeshua as the Jewish Messiah, who embraced sola scriptura and tota scriptura. I never claimed that my beliefs were the only view throughout history, so stop making false accusations and actually address reality. Third, notice what Bart Ehrman doesn't say. He doesn't say that since there was no fixed New Testament at the time, we don't know anything about the beliefs of those that called themselves Christians in those days. That is exactly what Shadid is trying to attribute to Ehrman. Ehrman is saying that because there wasn't a fixed New Testament, therefore the beliefs were diverse. How does Ehrman know this? Well, because there was extensive writings in those centuries about those beliefs. Therefore, we know that with all those different beliefs, none include Mary in the Trinity. Note how Shadid first said that we supposedly didn't know anything about the early church because there was no fixed New Testament. But then he quotes Bart Ehrman saying exactly the opposite, that we do know a great deal about the early church because of the extensive writings. But note what the quote of Bart Ehrman says, and how Shadid completely misreads him, surprise, surprise, to be able to make his case. Bart Ehrman says, we know a good deal about Christianity during the 2nd and 3rd centuries. The time, say, between the completion of the writings of the New Testament books and the conversion of the Roman Emperor Constantine to the religion, which, as we have seen, changed everything. Taking a statement from Ehrman that is about the 2nd and 3rd century and then applying it as an argument for Muhammad's time in the 7th century is very disingenuous, Shadid. Ehrman is talking about the 2nd and 3rd centuries, not about the time of Muhammad. How did Bart Ehrman know this? Well, again, because they were all documented. People wrote extensively about heretical views in those times. Furthermore, the fact that there was no fixed New Testament in the 2nd and 3rd century doesn't negate the fact that there was a fixed canon long before Muhammad's day. This is what Ehrman means when he says that from the time of Constantine, it changed everything. How did everything change? Well, on page 72, Ehrman explains. When did the church begin to use professional scribes to copy its texts? There are good reasons for thinking that this happened sometime near the beginning of the 4th century. Until then, Christianity was a small minority religion in the Roman Empire, often opposed, sometimes persecuted. But a cataclysmic change occurred when the Emperor of Rome, Constantine, converted to the faith about 312 CE. Suddenly, Christianity shifted from being a religion of social outcasts, persecuted by local mobs and imperial authorities alike, to being a major player in the religious scene of the empire. Not only were persecutions halted, but favors began to pour out upon the church from the greatest power in the Western world. So what changed since the days of Constantine? Before those days, there were no professional scribes, and Christianity was a renegade religion. For the most part, Christians were getting killed and their documents were getting destroyed. There was such a diversity of theology because everyone was reading all those diverse manuscripts outside of the documents of what later became known as the New Testament. Although there was no fixed canon, those New Testament documents were in circulation and used by everyone. The earliest church fathers quoted extensively from the New Testament books and letters. Even the Gnostics quoted from them. We know that what these deviant groups taught was heretical because they quoted from those texts of the New Testament and went on to distort what those texts said by adding their own biblical views to them and then attribute those to the apostles. They couldn't let the text be the text. Furthermore, when they would do that, they would be exposed by the people around them. Anyone that was caught tampering with the documents of the New Testament was publicly placated. The community didn't keep these things silent. But note, once the New Testament was established and therefrom flowed the doctrines that were eminent from the Scriptures, those diverse theological views of God died out. By the time we get to the 7th century, we know exactly what the New Testament taught and what the views scattered heretical groups believed. But this is the bottom line, folks. Whatever heretical views of God we have found throughout the ages, none correspond with Mary being a part of the Trinity, as the Quran says. So Shadid, the Quran remains wrong, and even your misapplication of Bart Ehrman cannot save your God from his blissful ignorance. I can say that the Quran is wrong because the group that Allah talks about never existed. Surah 5 verse 73 through 75, Surah 4 verse 171, and Surah 5 verse 116 are all the product of the ignorance of a desert Arab called Muhammad, who heard Christians talk about a father and a son and immediately thought of a mother when hearing about the Trinity.
Alright, so let's go ahead now and delve into these verses directly and see what exactly is being said and who is being addressed. Actually, if you start from verse 68, we see that it is not just the Christians that are being addressed. It is both the Christians and the Jews from the people of the book, because it says in verse 68, "Say, O people of the book, you follow no good till you observe the Torah and the gospel and that which is revealed to you from your Lord." So obviously Jews follow the Torah, Christians say they follow the gospel, and they are being told that they will follow no good till they also follow that which has been revealed to you from your Lord, meaning the Quran. And so this section deals with the disbelievers from amongst the Jews and the various types of disbelievers from amongst the Christians. And so the main subject matter when it comes to dealing with Jesus, if we start actually at verse 72, it says, "Certainly they disbelieve who say Allah, He is the Messiah, son of Mary." So the first thing that's being addressed here when we get to these verses here is that God is not Jesus, or Jesus is not God. So as we see, nowhere is Mary referred to in this verse as being a member of the Trinity or as being God or any such thing. This verse is just dealing with the claim of those who disbelieve, who say that Jesus is God. So here Allah is dealing with the issue of Jesus, who He is. Who is Jesus? He's not God here. Then in the next verse, it's separate from the previous verse. Now the next verse addresses a different claim of those who disbelieve, those who say that God is three. You see? So here Allah is addressing different issues. They're not all meant to be compiled to be talking about the Trinity. As we saw, 572 is addressing the issue of who is Jesus. Jesus is claimed to be God, and Allah is clearing that up, that Jesus is not God. Then in 573, Allah addresses another issue now, which is the issue of those who claim that God is three. Notice each of the